Hello, I'm delighted today to be joined by Lord Deben, John Gummer. Lord Deben is the former Secretary of State for the Environment and current Chair of the UK Climate Change Commission. He has had and continues to have a very long and distinguished career, not just in politics, but sustainability and food and energy and agriculture in particular. Particularly pleased to be joining you today, Lord Deben, in the current surroundings that we have here, the wonderful surroundings of the Eden Project. Lord Deben's already been educating me on various plant species and their adaptability to climate change in different scenarios. We're here in the Mediterranean biome at the Eden Project, which is a particularly lovely and tranquil surroundings to be having our discussion today. So thank you very much for taking the time today, Lord Deben. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations. And one of the themes that we're talking to people about this year, and this year where we're hosting the Foresight Sustainability Forum at Eden, is to ask people about what makes them hopeful and optimistic, and also what worries them or makes them kind of pessimistic. So just to kick things off, I thought it'd be fantastic if you could talk a little bit about just how you view the world at the minute and what makes you hopeful and what makes you worried.
Well, I've been chairman of the Climate Change Committee for over 10 years now. I've come to the legal limit of where I can go on. And so if I look backwards and think, would I have thought 10 years ago that we would have gone as far as we have? The answer is no. I don't think 10 years ago I could have imagined that we'd have had the Paris Agreement that every nation on earth has signed up to fight climate change. Now, of course, they'll not all do what they've promised, and we'll have to ratchet it up, and it will be all that. But the fact is, we never thought everybody would do that. And now, after Glasgow, we've moved even further in a way which I don't think anybody thought 10 years ago we could. And now looking across the Atlantic to Joe Biden and his policies on climate change, you're beginning to see the most powerful nation on earth actually taking this seriously. And also we have to recognise that even though people are rude about China for all kinds of reasons, the fact is China is doing an enormous amount to reduce its emissions. And of course much of its emission is our fault, if you like, because we have exported to them the manufacturing capability, and therefore they are really our emissions. So if you look around the world, there are all sorts of things that lead one to that conclusion that we've moved much faster and much further than I thought we would. But against that, the reality of climate change is ever more present, and the fear of not moving fast enough, and the fact that human beings are not good at dealing with urgency or delivery. I mean, the government has got the best targets in the world. It's encouraged the rest of the world to take those targets on, but its delivery is appalling. And the opposition isn't any better. The other thing is the opposition doesn't have a policy and a programme to counter that. It ought to have a detailed programme and be pushing the government at every point. And that's the problem about our consensus, which is another thing we ought to be very proud of, that all the major political parties, apart from the loony fringes, the major political parties are all committed to net zero and fighting climate change. And that's something we should be proud of. But the trouble with that is that consensus sometimes leads to complacency. And I think we really do need to push this much harder, to ramp it up much faster, and to be much tougher and say to governments and opposition, look, you can't do it on a sort of, well, we'll find out that and do that and test that. No, you actually have to move. We can't leave things to next year, because the flooding, the extreme storms, the reality of death for very large numbers of people is becoming an ever-present threat.
So there's a lot there in terms of progress you've seen on the political side of things, where we are today in terms of the political environment, the need for speed. I think then let's start with that last point you made, which actually is about the concern for just what is happening now and what is driving the need for speed. So my question to you would be, what is it that you see in particular that concerns you? What's the key pieces of evidence that you see, either personally in your own life and with your small holding, or more in the academic kind of world that gives you a real concern here?
Well, my own personal thing is that in my years of gardening since I started, spring has come 17 days earlier, and that the blossoms come out when the pollinators aren't there. That we've actually, in Britain, in many ways the least affected by climate change, we've actually mucked up the natural sequence. But secondly, it's just the constant facts. I mean, if you look just at this last fortnight, we had the Prime Minister of New Zealand who called two or three of us together to talk about climate change because of the devastating floods they've had in Auckland and indeed in Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. So that he said climate change is now at the top of the agenda. At the same time, if you look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they have very, very large numbers of deaths because of the flooding. If you look at what's happening at this moment in Myanmar and what's happening in Southeast Asia, these are temperature rises and storms which we have never seen before. And that means, of course, that when I talk to right-wing audiences who are very concerned about immigration, one has to say, you've not seen anything yet. Because what climate change does is to make people have to move. I mean, it's not just a question of economic migration, it's a question of you can't live there any longer if the temperature is 50 degrees. You can't do that. And if you look at a country like Bangladesh, where almost all of it, if not all, is under sea level and the sea is rising and they have to redeploy about 250,000 people every year now. Once people are on the march, there's not much you can do about it. And I just think people have got to recognise urgent action, not least to make life better in the countries where people are threatened, and protect them and help them to change and get through to a new world without the dirty in-between that we've been in. That's going to be just as important as fighting climate change through the Paris Accord.
Exactly. Well, I think when you put it like that, that's very powerful, and it feels like in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, we've gone from climate change being a future risk to being something that is very real and very now. I was talking to one of our colleagues yesterday who's based up in Scotland and manages our forestry fund, and he was saying that we were talking about salmon fishing and the decline of salmon numbers basically in most of the Scottish rivers, and apparently that is quite clearly due to rising water temperatures, which is something I hadn't realised, but that's already affecting the breeding grounds up there. And then obviously when, as you've just walked through, then how this is impacting people much more on the front line. Obviously in Britain we are in some ways shielded from the worst effects of climate change for now. That brings me on to the first chunky topic I want to get into, which I know is a topic dear to your heart, which is food and the production of food. In the last few weeks, we've seen yet more data coming out of places like Spain, just showing how difficult things have been there due to heat waves at an extraordinarily early time in the year to be having that, and drought. How do you see the future food system looking in terms of where would you like us to be going to have a food system that is more resilient and able to feed us given all these challenges?
Well, first of all, we've got to get rid of some of the things that we've been doing. We can no longer think that by spraying fields and putting artificial fertilisers on them, we'll go on having harvests forever, because frankly we won't, because we're not recreating the fertility of the soil. We've reduced fertility all over the world enormously, and we've got to put that back. And part of the way of doing that is having mixed farming, so that we use cows and sheep as part of the mix. We've got to restrict the numbers because of the emissions they make, and we've got to feed them pasturally, which is important as far as the amount of emissions. And by improving their animal health, we will need fewer to produce the same amount. All those things we can do, but it's going to mean much more hands-on farming. And there's no doubt that regenerative farming can produce just as much as the kind of industrialised farming we've had up to now. But it does involve a much greater attention to detail, and it means the farmer is much more involved than he has been in the systems that we've had up to now. And then the food system has got to change, because at the moment we are making people fat because of the way in which we make food, and the big food companies are really going to have to look again at how they produce food, because an awful lot of the stuff that we eat we shouldn't be eating because it is ultra high processed, and that is bad for the body, and it's not something that we should be doing. And that's what's wrong with fast food. It isn't that it's fast, and it isn't that it's that the actual ingredients are bad for you. It's the way it's made. It's the system. And so there are huge changes we have to make there. And then at the other end of it, we've really got to learn to be able to eat without waste. I mean, between 40 and 50% of the food we produce, we waste. Well, you've only got to save a lot of that when you can feed people much more effectively. And we're going to be able to grow in places we can't grow now, and we're going to have to change some of the, I think, by genetic modification. We ought to be gene editing rather than the old-fashioned kind of way of doing it, but gene editing. We ought to be able to grow things in places with less water than we have up to now. There's all sorts of things that we can do of that kind, but we've actually got to work at it. And of course, at the other end, we need to spend money on women's education and the kind of development that we do. And it's a scandal that the government should have cut back from 0.7% to 0.5%, breaking its own promise. You don't kick people who are worse off than yourself when you're in a difficulty. That is unacceptable morally, but it's also very stupid, because it's women's education which will bring about a halt in the rise in the population and enable people to live in a more sensible way.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. And then, so it's clear that regenerative farming has a very big role to play, and it's clear we need to stop doing the things we've been doing in terms of blanket herbicides and pesticides. There's another avenue we could be investing in, which is to produce more food through infrastructure, so through glass houses, or it could be vertical farms, or producing food with very little input, so using techniques such as cultured meats or microbial food production. And it feels like there are two quite sort of different paths we could be going down. One is more rooted in nature, and one is more rooted in technology. One of the arguments on the technology side of things is, if you can produce a lot of food and nutrition from a very small footprint, you can obviously free up lots of land for basically to put it back to ecosystem services. And things like pastoral production or sheep production in particular just uses a lot of land. And I tend to think of, when we think about these problems, we tend to have different hats on. When we're thinking about the nature solutions, then that's when we are being prophets. So this goes back to Charles Mann's definition of people being wizards or prophets. So prophets are people that talk about working with nature and within the limits of nature, whereas wizards talk about using technology as the answer. So it's clear from your perspective that regenerative agriculture and working with nature is very much part of the solution, or always driving the solution. Do you see any role to play in technology alongside that, using more kind of artificial production of food?
Well, I don't like the word artificial. It seems to me that if you use technologies like greenhouses and the similar things, you're actually naturally producing, but ensuring that you help things by protecting them against the extremes. And as we're going to have more and more extreme weather, you can see that that's going to be valuable. And again, if you talk about vertical farming, given that you are careful about what your inputs are, you can have a vertical farming which is the production of proper natural food. That's what I have very big questions about are artificial food, which seems to me, first of all the latest evidence is that lab-grown meat has a bigger carbon footprint than the naturally grown meat. And the point about naturally grown meat is that we have to distinguish between sensible numbers and the overstocking that we have gone in for. If you have sensible numbers, then you get the balance so that the arable land is made more fertile, not only because the cow shits, that not only because of that, but because of the way it walks and the way that it opens up the land, and then a rather different way of walking, the sheep. Of course, the other issue is that what we call nature in Britain is entirely artificial. I mean, almost without exception, one or two of the peaks of Scotland and Wales, but elsewhere, what we call nature is artificial. It's farmed, and we don't want to lose that. And that's why I find this word rewilding a pretty peculiar word. If you mean opening up more of the opportunities for the countryside to be ecologically diverse, if you want to bring back not only the plants but also the birds and the insects, which is what we do in all the land that we have, not a great deal, but we do it all the time. If you do that, that's a perfectly sensible thing, but I don't call it rewilding, because that is not what Britain has been for 2,000, even longer. Yeah, that's not what it's about. But I'm unhappy about people who think that you can fiddle around on the extremes of food. I don't want to be in a position in which we ask people to exist on a mushroom mush or tablets or some brave new world answer, because that isn't human. Food is something to be enjoyed. It's a crucially central part of our society. Sitting round a table and eating and drinking, it's not surprising that it's the central part of most religions of the world. And if you think of the Eucharist, it's about bread and wine, it's about reality, and it's about food, and it's about what feeds us in a material way as well as a spiritual way. So if human beings have been like that, I find it very difficult to suggest that the main way forward is to produce something that's got nothing to do with nature. I think we've got to find a way in which nature can fulfill itself, and that means partly the way in which we grow things and produce things, partly the number of people that we have so that we can make those choices ourselves in terms of population, and partly too in how wasteful we are. I mean, we have become a very wasteful animal, and we have got to stop that.
I think that there's such important points there. I think the point you make about food being central to human culture is fundamental. And I don't know if you've ever watched the travels and the documentaries of Anthony Bourdain, the US, going around the world. Every single culture he goes to, food is at the core of it. Food and energy are increasingly interlinked, and food, energy, water are increasingly interlinked. We have seen great progress in renewable energy in recent years. One specific question for you I'm interested in your views on. So a trade-off between using land to produce energy and to produce food. In the UK, for example, we have some pushback on installing more solar power because it's taking up agricultural land. Do you have any views on that? Because I would have thought the actual amount of land area being used for solar is probably pretty negligible in terms of the UK's overall land bank of agricultural land.
Oh yes, that's just an excuse. I mean, it's the people don't want the solar, they've got to find some reason for it. They say it uses agricultural land. That's not it, they don't like it. The fact is that solar can be used with agriculture, and we all know that if you do it properly, you can have the sheep as well. I mean, this is not impossible. You've got to be careful about balancing the aesthetics as well. I'm not suggesting you should have it in ways which destroy the beautiful views, but there is no doubt that we can use solar as an important input. And the same is true of onshore wind. The thing we've got wrong is the way we connect this stuff up. I mean, it is amazing. We're supposed to be talk about technology. We're supposed to be tech whizzes. The fact of the matter is, National Grid is miles behind what it ought to be. The government has not done what it should do about linking things up. What on earth are we doing? Bringing each offshore wind array on land in separate forms without having round the sea a proper pipeline So what we're doing is destroying small villages quite unnecessarily. And near where I live, I can say this really is happening. The offshore wind was supposed to be offshore so that it wasn't onshore. What we're doing now is making it offshore and onshore and Great Islands. We've really got to learn not to dirty up in the new way what we used to do when we dug coal and left great piles of coal. I mean, that's very much what we're doing with the pylons and the rest. We've actually got to do it in an environmentally friendly way. And sometimes that means undersea. I think round the east coast of England it means that. In Wales, I think it means finding a way of taking the energy links over the mountains so that distant farmers are able to use the wind power that is there and put it into the grid. I mean, we have to look at this, but we are wildly behindhand on that. And all the government's commitments to gigawatts of offshore wind and the like will be of no use if we can't link it in. And if also we don't get the system so that all of us with our electric cars will be able to put electricity into the system, store it for the system at the same time as taking it out of the system. All that has to be done, and that does mean a kind of government leadership which we haven't had.
It feels as if there are some areas then when we're almost shooting ourselves in the foot, because to effectively decarbonise, as you say, we need to invest not only in the renewables, but we need to invest in the grid itself, and we need more forms of energy storage to accommodate more renewables. And that's a message you've been making for a long time. Why is progress slow on that? Is it just a lack of understanding in government or elsewhere? Or are there other kind of barriers that hold things back?
Well, I think it is true that government finds it very difficult to do these things because it is siloed in a way which just makes action. It's always been true, any government, nothing to do with party politics. It's always true that government is better at policy than it is at delivery. That is a fact of life. And that is true of this government. I think it's been harmed by two or three almost accidental things. The way in which we privatised the electricity system, we should never have allowed the national grid to have what was, in fact, in my view, a conflict of interest. And we should never have allowed it to be somewhere where they had interests in other countries instead of being concerned simply with this. Now, there have been major changes now, and I hope that that will be better. But I don't think National Grid has really set the example which it should have done. So the private sector has not been good. And many of those who actually deliver electricity, the delivery organisations, there's a big difference between the best and the worst of those. And so there's a great deal of improvement in the private sector to be seen. But the government has got to set the terms under which all this works. And I don't think it's had the urgency that we ought to have had on that front. I'm pleased with the fact that the Prime Minister has now got a new department of net zero and energy. I think that's a link which is right, and I hope to see from that we will get a very much better operation. It's a bit odd that the infrastructure system should be directly reporting to the Treasury, so you really do need a link between those two if we're actually going to get this right. But John Armitt, running the National Infrastructure Organisation, is at one with the Climate Change Committee on this. I mean, you can't put a cigarette paper between us on what we actually have to do. So the government's got the advice, it's just got to act on it.
Okay, that's interesting. And certainly from the private sector, and representing the investment community, we would emphasise that there is plenty of infrastructure capital that wants to be put to work in things like transmission assets will be a good example. These are fantastic infrastructure investments. We have to rebuild the whole world's economy. Transmission is a clear bottleneck, as you mentioned, access to the grid. And so if anyone from any government is listening, I would say please help facilitate that process of enabling private sector capital to get to work in transmission assets. Now I want to switch gears now, Lord Deben, reflecting on your career, and I think I'm right in saying that it's probably in the early 1970s when you were first working in agriculture and the environment. We talked a little bit about progress that's been made since then. How would you reflect upon the achievements of your generation, and what would you say to younger people who are concerned about climate? What's the best way that they can engage with it, and how should they think about climate change?
Well, I think my generation and your generation ought to accept that we have been the most fortunate generation ever. We haven't had a fight of war. Our sons have not been taken to the front as their first visit abroad. We've been better off than ever any previous generation. The wealth of the nation is very much in the hands of people of my age and younger. And so the first thing we have to say to the next generation is we've let you down, because we're going to hand on something that's much more difficult for them. We've done terrible things like leaving the European Union. Brexit is a very, very damaging thing for the next generation, and we've done that, much against my wish, but that's what we've done. We've left a world which is much more uncertain than it was 20 years ago. And therefore, we've left an inheritance which is wholly against what people of my political persuasion, others, are supposed to do. We're supposed to pass on to the next generation something better than we've received. So the first thing we have to say to the next generation is, I'm sorry, we've got it wrong. The second thing is we've got to do everything we can for as long as we're able to put it right, which is why I shall go on working as hard as I can for as long as I can, because this has to be done. You have to give the next generation hope. There's no doubt that we can win this battle. We have just about stepped in time. We are a last-minute kind of mammal. You leave it to the last. So we can do it, and we need to give them real encouragement to do that. And we have to learn again the fact that each individual counts, that we do have, each of us, to do what we can do. Cardinal Newman said, everyone has got a vocation. The lucky ones amongst us know what it is. And I think that's true. We all have a contribution to make, and that matters, and we ought to realise that pretty humble contributions are what makes the reality, and that's what we have to do. No one must feel left out of the battle which we have now to fight.
I think that's a really excellent way of summarising things. I would certainly concur with what you said there, Lord Deben. I think if anything that's coming out, it's a sense that we all need to have some humility here. We have all contributed to this problem, and it is younger people that will suffer the consequences of that. But what you're saying in terms of everyone being able to contribute, I think is such valuable advice, that the most important thing we can all do is we can engage in civic life, we can figure out how we can contribute personally towards this. And fundamental to that is recognising that this is a collective problem that we all have, and we can only fix it collectively. And that's how we should be spending our energies and our brain power, is how we fix it collectively, rather than having arguments about who is more morally virtuous in terms of these things. So thank you very much for your time, Lord Deben. We really appreciate it. And I'd also like to take this chance to thank you again for all the work you have done and are continuing to do so. You're a real inspiration in terms of the energy you apply to this. And it clearly is a challenge that spans multiple generations, but I hope that younger people can take inspiration from that.
Thank you.